Greetings, Earthlings. I'm Funky Alien, and today I want to talk about different real-time strategy playstyles. This is going to be the first part of a series in which I go over some different playstyles for RTS players. Now, these are going to be very basic generalizations of these playstyles, and everybody adds some unique personal spin to each playstyle as they gain experience. To help me visualize these different playstyles, I had to use some AI personalities from popular RTS games to get the general idea of how these playstyles work, as if I did it, I'd have some bias to my own playstyle. In this installment, I want to take a look at the playstyle of a Steamroller. The Steamroller style favors high tier units to overwhelm their opponents and is slow compared to other playstyles, but packs a massive punch against their opponents. At first, Steamrollers rush to gather large amounts of resources to get an economical edge over their opponent, and then they hope to overwhelm their opponent with high tier units as soon as possible. Now let's take a look at how a Steamroller's progression moves throughout a game. Alright, now let's get into it. In the early game, the Steamroller's objective is to create a dominating economy. They will use any method possible to get as many resources as they can. Let's take a look here at these two different scenarios on the screen. The one on the left is how a balanced playstyle would start out, and on the right side shows how a Steamroller player starts out. Looking at the Steamroller on the right, you can see that they have multiple refineries and have no military buildings. If you look at the left side, you can see that a balanced playstyle has one refinery, but it has a military building and some infantry at its disposal and is starting to move out of their base. This leaves the Steamroller player a little vulnerable to attack in the early game, but by this point in the game, Tier 1 infantry are not enough to eliminate a base. Now this is for an RTS that has an active collection of resources system. For passive resource gathering, this looks a little different. For passive resource collecting, a Steamroller will have the bare minimum amount of units and the most basic units fielded to collect resources. Now that we've talked about the early game, now let's talk about the mid game for a Steamroller. In the mid game, this is where a Steamroller really shows its effectiveness and can really be a real problem for their opponents. The mid game is when the Steamroller has gone all the way straight to top tier units with a mix of mid tier units and very few first tier units. While the opponents are starting to get light or medium armor vehicles in this part of the game, the Steamroller has an attack force with their heaviest and strongest units and are working to build their super units. Now, as you can see on the screen, the Steamroller on the right has built their top tier Tech 3 building and has constructed their top tier unit factory, where on the left, the balanced player has only built their base tier unit buildings and has only constructed their tier 2 tech building. The balanced player can have a larger army at this point and may have attacked the Steamroller's base before the Steamroller has built their army. In this part of the game, a Steamroller can have a great advantage over their opponent, but it's not always a guarantee that they do, because the other player can have fielded a larger army of lower tier units or has a better advantage because of map control. Alright, now let's talk about the late game. The late game for a Steamroller is not much different from the mid game, except that their opponent now might be on the same level of units as the Steamroller. At this point, it's all about who has better tactics and who can manage their units more effectively. The Steamroller does have one issue that their opponent may not have at this point in the game. This is their economy. The Steamroller at this point probably has spent most of their resources in the mid game and can't keep up with the late game upkeep of their current army. In the early part of the late game, the Steamroller might be able to field their super weapon or their more super units before other players field theirs. Now that we've talked about how a Steamroller's game looks like at the beginning, mid, and late game, let's talk about some pros and cons of a Steamroller. Let's start with the pros. The pros with the Steamroller is its strong economy. Steamroller is going to rush for as many resources as it can get to get as many strong units as it can as quickly as it can. The second pro of Steamroller is its quick to high tier units. This is because of that strong economy that we talked about before. And the advantage of having high tier units is that you can overwhelm your opponents easier. You can basically steamroll right over them because they are at a lower tier than you, and you can just easily walk into their base and destroy them. And another pro is able to end the game quickly. If you have higher tier units earlier in the game, then you can end the game quicker because you can just annihilate your enemy. And another pro is opponents find you unpredictable once you start to attack with high tier units early. Opponents in games are not going to be expecting high tier units really early in a game, so they have very few units or just lower tier units than what a steamroller has. So this is a good advantage of a steamroller. And some cons for steamrollers. Steamrollers are more vulnerable in the beginning stages of the game because since they're focused on economy, they're not focusing on building their military up. Now, yes, they may have some basic units just as a light defense, or they may have defensive structures at their base, but a strong attack force of light units from an enemy team can overrun those early defenses and early units. And then the second con of a steamroller is their lack of diversity in units. Usually this playstyle lacks a variety of units in its army composition. A good army will have a mix of low, mid, and high tier units. In the case of a steamroller, the army composition usually has more high tier units than any other tier units. This allows for vulnerabilities to be more exposed because it's not a more rounded army composition, since it's only focused on the highest tier units. Those are usually countered with lower tier units to balance out the game. And another con is that in the late game, it can be very challenging to keep up with the upkeep of high tier units. So if you lose a lot of units, those units are expensive, and if you don't have that much resources in the late game because you spent all of it in the mid game, then once you lose your units, it's going to be hard to replenish those units. You're going to have to fall back to mid tier or low tier units while your opponent is making high tier units. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. This is Funky Alien signing off.